Hi, Joe Markley back with a video after a long hiatus. I've had the chance, of course, to speak out regularly thanks to Todd Feinberg and Gary Byron and the opportunity to fill in from time to time on WTIC. And I get my views out in print one way or another as well. But as I've been further away from politics on a day-to-day basis, it's been harder to bring myself to do these videos. But there's a few topics I want to talk about, and they're tough topics, ranging from local to international. Tough because I don't think that even my friends are necessarily going to agree with everything I have to say. But I think that it's things that need to be said. And let me start with the big picture and my concerns about our current involvement in Ukraine. It's funny that I initially got interested in politics because of the Vietnam War, which was going on when I was a boy, actually, and I studied it to some extent, foreign policy, in college, with great interest. But it's never been a part of my political career, which has wholly involved state issues, and maybe just as well, because I think a lot of the people that liked me best on state issues wouldn't have necessarily liked where I stood on international issues. I do believe that Americans are peaceful people. I think most people in most countries are peaceful. It's funny that history is a litany of battles, but I think that's misleading. I think for the vast majority of mankind, war has been a very distant thing, maybe an unknown thing. We, once upon a time, most of us were farmers. We lived in small communities. We lived far from the drama of population centers. What we had were the basics of life. Birth, marriage, children, old age, death, love, friendship, community, faith, work, things that aren't really historical, but things which are essential to each one of us as an individual. And I think what we want is the chance to enjoy those things without the threat of violence in an orderly society that basically leaves us alone. And that was Thomas Jefferson's dream for this country, and many others of the founders, a kind of a vast garden bordered on either side by tremendous oceans, peopled by strong, independent folks who were armed, who could repel invasion, but who would be like a giant Switzerland, involved with other nations, friends with all, but never looking to involve ourselves in quarrels overseas. George Washington spoke about that in his farewell address, which is very much worth reading if you haven't or you haven't read it recently. And one of the things he said we needed to do what he said was to ensure our tranquility. He said, "Nothing is more essential than that permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others should be excluded, and that in place of them, just and amicable feelings towards all should be cultivated. The nation which indulges towards another a habitual hatred or a habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest." Yet I'm afraid we look at things overseas and have a tendency to pick sides and say we want to support the good guys against the bad guys. In our own history, it's been fairly easy, and I think that deceives us. We had a magnificent conception in the Revolutionary War, freeing ourselves from a country which by no means did we hate, a country that gave us our language and our culture and our system of law and the vision of self-government, that we separated from successfully and without great rancor. And another great war, the Civil War, to eradicate the sin, our sin of creation, the sin of slavery. Those were successful wars in the sense that they settled issues. But I think most wars are not successful. And if we look at our own history, we've engaged in a number of them that were unnecessary. In the very next one after the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, really prompted by war hawks that just wanted to go up and seize Canada. Not a war we needed to undertake, not a war that accomplished anything. In 1846, a war that we provoked against Mexico, General Grant, who served there, said it was one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. We fought Spain in 1898 because we accused them of blowing up the Maine, which almost certainly they didn't do. And subsequently, having taken control of the Philippines, we fought the Filipinos for years because they wanted to be free from us naturally and rule themselves. We jumped into World War I, a war that was winding down, a horrible war, but that would have ended in a negotiated and fairer peace. Our jumping in made it a punitive war, and it led to the disaster of World War II. And then we were in Vietnam, which was where I started this talk, a war that became so unpopular I thought we would never intervene overseas again. But what did we do subsequently? In Panama, in Somalia, in Serbia, two big wars in Iraq, a long war in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen. We still have troops in many of these countries. How have those wars worked out for us and for the countries involved and for the people in those countries? Not well, in my opinion. The advocates of those interventions inevitably claim we gave up too early. The American people only have so much stomach for this kind of conflict. And that has to be understood before we get involved in these situations. That the waste of treasure, but even more the waste of blood involved, is going to be limited. And we can't expect, you can't claim afterwards that 20 years in Afghanistan wasn't long enough. But it doesn't matter why the policy fails. What we see is the interventions fail over and over again. As they fail, the excuses proliferate. But really the problem is it's not a good idea, and more failures will come if we keep pursuing this line of action. We have a sorry record, and what's going on in Ukraine, in my opinion, is unlikely to improve it. We're far from home. We're on the border of a country that has the capacity to devastate us. That fight means more to Russia and to the Ukrainians than it possibly can mean to us. In a way, that's the definition of something being none of our business. It's not our fight. I don't believe it's our job to set right international wrongs. We simply can't do it. And if we're honest about the costs, we can't afford to try to do it. We'd be in a better position if we followed that old adage to speak softly and carry a big stick. One of our stated goals in Ukraine is to drain Russia, to weaken Putin, weaken them by sacrificing Ukrainian lives for Russian lives, for our own strategic ends. I think that's immoral foreign policy. Again, talking about something that I saw in my own lifetime, in 1968, when the Czechs were attempting to get themselves out of the orbit of the Soviet Union, and the Russians invaded, we had the sense, and maybe we had the sensitivity, not to encourage them to fight, not to arm. They were willing to die for their country, but it would have been murder to encourage them to die for their country, because in that situation at that moment they couldn't win. That cause is hopeless in Ukraine as well. When they talk about retaking territory, including even retaking the Crimean, they're talking about something that, in my opinion, will never happen. Now, if events prove me wrong, bring this tape back to my attention. But I think Russia will end up getting what it wants because it's stronger and it's closer and it's determined. The best we can hope for is some kind of a stalemate that leaves us with, leaves Russia in possession of Crimea and Donbass and the eastern part of the country, and a western part that's able to be still an independent Ukraine. We could have had peace and a united Ukraine as a neutral country, but we were determined to see it militarized, to have it eligible to come into NATO. I think that was a mistake, and I think that the Ukrainians are paying for that mistake, and I don't think we should force them to pay any more. Remember, too, that we're being drained. We're being drained financially by the support that we're giving for this, which is a huge expense, and the support that Ukraine will require after the fighting is over, given the amount of destruction that has taken place. At the same time, we're forcing our strategic adversaries closer together. Russia now is being supplied by China and Iran. And much of the rest of the world outside of Western Europe, including emerging powers like India, are very skeptical about our involvement and the entire NATO involvement with the Ukrainian conflict. I have to say, growing up during the Vietnam War, it never occurred to me that we'd blunder into a situation like this, where we don't really have a direct stake, where we don't have a full understanding of the facts, where we don't have a clear vision of what our mission is. General, later President Dwight Eisenhower was the furthest thing from an alarmist, in my opinion. But in his farewell address, effectively, he said, "Beware of the military-industrial complex." There has long been a force within American government and within the American economy as well, that has supported our overseas interventions. I don't say that they're ill-intentioned. I think they sincerely believe that this is the best thing for the country. It may be the best thing for them as well. But their vision of security requires us to project our power far beyond our borders. The trouble is, it will never be far enough. In this case, we want to have power right on the border of our greatest ostensible enemy, Russia. It's the Roman paradox, which is, in order to protect yourself, you keep extending your lines, but the further you extend them, the weaker they become. And meanwhile, the real problem is the rot that's taking place back at home. And that's very true for us. My friends on the right, who are skeptical about everything that President Biden does, ought to be skeptical about him in this. It's a little hard for me to imagine why anyone would think that people like Biden and Blinken and Hillary Clinton and the others that are so passionate about supporting Ukraine would be right about this when they're wrong about everything else. What amazes me is there's no real peace party. There's a few voices on the right and a few voices on the left. At least during Vietnam, there was a movement for it. We should have some humility about the limits of our power and the limits of our understanding. We should have a desire at every moment to end fighting. Instead, there's a irrational hostility towards the very idea of negotiation. Conservatives ought to trust their instincts, which recognize the limit of what government can accomplish and the limit of what we can perfect and correct in the world. America was not meant to be an empire, and most of our foreign adventures over these last 7 decades have gone wrong. We have a chance in the upcoming Republican primaries to choose between candidates that are really all in for intervention and those who are more skeptical. And I would really encourage everyone to make this a serious issue in the choices that they make, because it's a life and death issue for many people in many parts of the world. And given the dangers that exist right now, I think it's a life and death issue for us as well. So that's my rant about Ukraine. Thank you for your patience in hearing me out. I appreciate your opinions on it as well. And I will be back to you on a couple of other vexed subjects over the next few weeks. This is Joe Markley. Appreciate your time.